Red Bull as a team, it's a throw you in the deep end kind of place. Like even for me, you know, like I remember when I first took on that sort of race team role, doing engines, I'd never done it. One of the things that I always noticed it in was pit stops.
Yeah.
Like I always used to think to myself, especially when Netflix first started, there would just be this awareness that if you screw this up, it's gonna
it's gonna make the title sequence.
Do you know what I mean? It's gonna be the title sequence, or
Hi, I'm Marc Priestley. I spent almost a decade at the McLaren Formula One team alongside inspirational people such as Kimi Raikkonen, Lewis Hamilton, Fernando Alonso, but also people like Adrian Newey and Ron Dennis. I created the Pitlane Life Lessons Podcast to share many of those things that I've learnt with you to help you to think about the challenges in your life a little bit more like a Formula One team might think about them. Enjoy. Hey everybody, today's guest is Calum Nicholas. He's the former senior engine technician at Red Bull Racing, now social media star and author of this brand new book, Life in the Pit Lane. He talks today in the conversation about some of the unbelievable coincidental similarities between our two journeys through Formula One, but also some of the stark differences that come from working between McLaren Racing on my side and Red Bull Racing on his. These are differences that will open your eyes to a new level of Formula One, but the conversation should also leave you truly inspired that no matter who you are and what background you come from, Formula One could be a huge opportunity for your future or for that of your kids. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Calum, I have just read your book. It's amazing. I read it all the way to Australia and back again. Could not put it down. Loved every second of it. What an amazing journey you've been on. There are so many similarities to the journey that I went on and the one that I'm on now with, we'll get into what you're about to start and embark on is the next stage of your journey, but also a lot of differences. So I want to get into all of that and maybe we can just discuss back and forwards what our experience has been like. But let's start with how you sort of got into Formula One, because I guess similar to me, it feels like, having read your story, it was largely down to massive amounts of persistence, just like a relentless pursuit to get there.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, firstly, I'm glad you enjoyed it. But yeah, I think definitely it was, once I decided that this was what I was going to do, then yes, it was all down to just being persistent and focused and working through the short-term goals to get there. I guess the beginning of the book, it sort of just describes in terms of how it took me so long to discover it in the first place. You know, I talk about that probably being my only real regret, is that it just took me a little while to find it. But yeah, once I got there, mate, it was very much just about, set myself short-term goals, see what the bigger picture is and just slowly work towards it and just, be persistent.
And was that persistence something, first of all, that you've always had in you as in a characteristic? And when you look back on it now, do you think that given you had those characteristics, were you sort of exactly the sort of person that an F1 team needs? Or did you sort of use blunt force to force your way through the door and then figure out what was required of you?
I mean, I guess in terms of how I've always been like that, I've always been quite stubborn and sort of, I've always been sort of hard-headed in terms of once I decide something, that's what I've decided.
Yeah.
It's an odd one though. Like I wasn't always necessarily that competitive kid. Like he had to find something that I was interested in. It was always, you know, at school I was a nightmare. You know, I was an awful student. Like there were some teachers that would sort of say, "Oh, Calum's brilliant and he does all of this," and then other students and other teachers that would just be like, "What's this guy doing? He's not interested. He doesn't want to be it."
Same for me.
And it was entirely about the subject matter.
Yeah.
You know, if you were engaging and I was interested, you got all of it. You're like, I was 100% in. But the moment you lose that for me, then I'm disruptive.
Yeah. I think I was very similar, and it was F1 and motorsport in a more general sense that really was the thing that put me on the straight and narrow, if you like, and gave me something to focus on. And in the same way, I was relentless, I was persistent to get there. But I'm thinking about it in the terms of, you know, if you think about what an F1 team does, they are relentless. They're in their pursuit of excellence. They're trying to achieve their goals, which are, you know, winning races and championships. And it's that persistence against all of the odds, which is exactly the nature of the best Formula One teams. So with a bit of hindsight, it feels like you are exactly what a Formula One team should be looking for. Yeah,
I think so. I think that, you know, when you're an F1 team and you're trying to hire, you want people with that determination in their own lives and their own paths, because that sort of speaks to what they can offer you in your own goals as a team. I think for me, when I talk about it in the book, I think very much I landed at a place that suited my personality. As you all know, you know, F1 teams vary in their approach quite greatly. For me, you know, Red Bull have always been that sort of rebellious, not that interested in hierarchy or tradition. It's all about doing the best job you can right now and the way you can do it, and finding different ways to do things. And that suited me. Like, absolutely, I've always been that person that doesn't necessarily want to conform anyway. I'm all about making it work for me and for those around me.
Yeah, and I definitely want to get into some of those differences of approach between, you know, the team that you spent most of your career at and the one that I did, which were vastly different. Both had massive amounts of success. We'll come to that in a moment, but just let's come back to the journey towards Formula One, because some of the similarities that jumped out in your story to mine, there were some bizarre ones in that the guy that gave you your first ever break, you talk about it in the book, where you sort of wandered down a pit lane at Silverstone on a lunch break from the motorsport college there. And you found a guy called Clive Denham who was working for a small team, and you sort of offered your services, and he was the only guy in that pit lane to give you an opportunity, allowed you to come along and try your hand.
The only one.
Only one.
Like, I spoke to every team in that paddock that day, and no one was interested apart from Clive.
Which is amazing in itself, and we'll explore that in a moment. But that same guy, Clive Denham, and we've spoken about this, you know, because I couldn't help but message you as soon as I read it. The same guy, Clive Denham, who no one out there will have heard of because he runs such a relatively small team, gave me the same opportunity probably 10 years ahead of you.
Yeah.
Again, the only person to respond to one of my messages, my letters as it was back then. He was working in a small Caterham racing team in North London back then. And I decamped, moved up to London and became the guy that made the tea and swept the floors for a few months. So what an amazing coincidence that is, first of all, eh?
I mean, it is a huge coincidence. But one of the things I say that a lot of the time we always have this saying in motorsport, there's no friends in motorsport, you know, and it's a myth anyway. But I think that thing with Clive, it sort of speaks to the fact that you will find people in the industry that just want to help others progress, you know. Like, it can be a really ruthless place. It can be like really sort of solo and individual goals and things like that. But, you know, 10 years apart, the same person still in that position where he's happy to help a young mechanic and give him the opportunity. It says a lot.
Well, it says a lot about him, absolutely. I think both of us will have a huge amount of time and gratitude for what he did for both of us, because he set us both on a path that eventually led to the pinnacle of motorsport. But also, you're right, it's another reminder that as well as that hard work and relentless nature and all the persistence that we both had, you need a bit of luck. You need someone to give you a chance, right?
Yeah, for sure. That's racing all over. You know, you can do everything right. You can do all the things you're supposed to. You can make everything work the best you can. Sometimes it's not enough. Sometimes you need a bit of luck to just sort of get you over the edge. And yeah, I sort of, you know, that sort of epitomizes racing in its sort of entirety, you know?
Yeah. Well, the other thing it does for me, and it reminded me of it reading it in your story, is that, you know, me, but also you now are both in a position where we might now get the opportunity to give someone else that help that they require. You know, I'm sure you're getting messages all the time now, people asking for advice or for help. We're now in a position to be able to give that.
Amazing. Yeah. No, I kind of see it as like a real responsibility now, if I'm honest. And it was one of the first things that sort of inspired me to write the book. Yeah. Was that I feel like sometimes, you know, with like content and all of this stuff, we're as humans, we consume it so quickly that it can be forgotten about. And I felt like writing a book meant that it was something a little bit more lasting that people could look to and reference and say, oh, well, I could do this and do that. So yeah, it's amazing to be able to sort of try and give those opportunities to other people now.
Yeah. Another unbelievable coincidence that I thought as I read it was that you met your partner, Phoebe, who works in Formula One. You met her in Shanghai. I also met my wife, who works in Formula One in Shanghai as well, which is just incredible.
Who thought that China would be the country of love?
There you go. It's amazing, isn't it? Yeah. But I mean, speaking of our partners, our other halves, in this world of motorsport, but I guess in particular Formula One, how much reliance have you had to have on the person who often gets left behind? Because I know for me, I literally couldn't have done it without my wife's support, and I'm sure it's the same for you.
No, I mean, it's exactly that. One of the first things I always say to people say, you know, what are the things you need to work in Formula One? And one of the things I always say is a very understanding partner, you know, someone that really is behind your goals and willing to sort of make sacrifices. And it's something I talk about in the book that Phoebe had made huge sacrifices over the last few years for me to go and sort of live my dream and achieve my goals. And one of the reasons ultimately I decided it was time to sort of put the spanners down was because it was time for me to sort of help her go and live the things that she needed in her life.
Yeah, and so you're now giving her the opportunity to do that. So no more travelling for you. We should clarify, people may not know that. So you're no longer travelling to every race with the team.
Nope.
But you've picked up a new role. What's that?
I have. So I've picked up a new role as a Red Bull Racing brand ambassador. It's a very big change of pace for me. Obviously, you know, it's been best part of 15 years sort of on the road, travelling, turning spanners and racing. And this is a very, very different role. But I'm so far I'm loving it. It's something that I'm really enjoying. Something that sort of I'd been building towards for a little while, you know, doing bits of media and obviously writing the book. So yeah, bit of a leap, bit of a change, but I feel like that's good. It's sort of awakened me a little bit, and yeah.
Well, I feel like you need, you know, we spoke about this a bit earlier on, but Formula One's such a sort of regimented life.
Yeah.
It's an amazing life and provides so many opportunities, and we both, you know, managed to find our way to the top of that in our careers, both managed to win, you know, big things. So the big prizes, we tick those boxes. But you're very much on someone else's schedule.
Yeah.
You're doing what someone else wants you to do, when they want you to do it. You're even wearing what they say.
Yeah.
It's very much controlled, isn't it? And I'm certainly not complaining about any of that. It was amazing. But the moment you step away, certainly I found, the biggest thing that hit me was the sudden and immediate freedom that you feel like you've got to make choices in your life.
Yeah, I mean, that was the biggest thing. And don't get me wrong, for the first few weeks, it was really strange. Like, I only took this role on it was the week before we were prepping to go to Bahrain for pre-season testing. So in my mind, I was sort of all prepped and starting to think about.
You were ready to go again, were you?
I was almost ready to go again, yeah. So it was like quite a drastic change and quite quick. But it took me a few weeks to sort of be like, right, okay, this is where I'm at and this is what I'm doing. And also I wake up in the morning and I can look at what work I'm going to do and what I'm going to take on. But also, you know, I get the opportunity and the freedom to shape it around my life and have a bit more balance. Because, you know, one thing that Formula One as a travelling technician, it doesn't give you is a great deal of work-life balance. You know, it is an all-in kind of job. So yeah, big change, but it's been good.
It's exciting, and I'm excited for you. I feel like I'm a few years ahead of you down this path,
sure.
You know. But I can tell you from my own experience that there's an amazing set of opportunities out there that you often can't see when you're buried knee deep in Formula One itself at the coalface. It's only once you step outside you start to find opportunities that you couldn't even notice. So that's an exciting time. You've got great times ahead, I've no doubt. Let's talk about the differences between our teams and our experiences for those teams,
Absolutely.
right? Because I remember being at McLaren, and people will know, particularly back in the Ron Dennis era of McLaren, it was very much a sort of strict regime. Attention to detail was our thing, led by Ron himself. It was quite corporate. Even the colours were grey, you know, at times. We had an awful lot of fun inside the team, but certainly the outward perspective of our team was very serious and strict. Red Bull turned up in, 2005, I think they came in. They came in with an explosion, with a bang, right? And there was a new party happening every week that the entire paddock was invited to. And it was amazing just to be there at the time when Red Bull rocked up. So my view of Red Bull was very much outwardly fun. Yeah. It was doing things differently. How do you see it, and how do you see it compared to some of the other teams around you?
Well, I mean, like you said, when I remember I first joined the paddock and I was at Marussia, outwardly, like you said, McLaren still had that image of being very strict and very proper. They also had, you know, the reputation of having a spotless garage throughout the weekend. There was no mess, no clutter. And yeah, I mean, like you said, it's definitely the other end of the spectrum at Red Bull. For years, I've always called us the Pitlane Pirates. It's sort of organised chaos. That's how we sort of live.
Thanks so much for getting this far through today's episode. I would love it if you could interact somehow with the Pitlane Life Lessons podcast by dropping us a like or a comment, a rating, wherever it is you're listening or watching. It really makes a massive difference. Back to the episode.
Red Bull sort of deserve a bit of credit, I think, for making the sport a little bit more welcoming in some ways. You know, I think like there was never any interest in keeping it this sort of closed off, almost like, and I think I say in the book, at times it felt like Bernie was trying to keep the whole thing a secret. And like you said, Red Bull sort of came in with a bang, and it was clear that they were just going to do things differently from day one, and it's very much like that. And I think for me, the things that always suited me about it was that there was no sort of thing of like, this is the hierarchy and things have to be done this way. If you had a better way of doing stuff, no one was going to have a problem with you, let's say, disregarding that hierarchy and whatever, because if it works, it works.
Yeah.
If it helps you win, it helps you win. There was never any sort of, oh no, but this is the proper way to do it. There, almost some ways for Red Bull, there is no proper way.
Yeah.
There's a way that works and there's the other way.
Yeah, which, if you have that kind of culture within any organisation, you tend to breed innovation, or you tend to breed the conditions that provide innovation, because people are not afraid to do something different or to try something, experiment. And Formula One's all about experimentation, isn't it? It's coming up with the very best solution you can, particularly one that no one's done before, because there's an advantage in that. So if you create those conditions, and look, Red Bull's a great example, you've had a huge amount of success off the back of it.
Yeah, at the same time, we've had some rough years. I think, what comes with that is sort of an acceptance that there are times where you're going to fail, you're going to fall short. And you're going to learn from it. I think, even at the moment with the current performance of the car, they're very much in a position where they're trying to just learn and understand. But there's never any sort of, oh my God, this has all gone horribly wrong. Yeah. It is very much a right, how do we make it right? But yeah, like I said, it's been an incredible experience. I think, we talk about the differences in teams, and I very much feel like I wouldn't have been able to get to this position perhaps in many other teams. Like the Red Bull gave me a sort of freedom and an understanding of what I could offer the team and sort of their goals. Yeah. But in order to do it, they sort of gave me a freedom to sort of go and find it and work it out for myself.
Yeah, it feels like you said, it feels like a sort of perfect fit.
Yeah.
Your character and nature with that particular team. It's not that I was, necessarily so detail orientated that I fitted naturally to McLaren. I probably had a bit of that. But I think once I got there and was sort of almost trained or encouraged to behave that way or to work that way, it felt like a good fit, and I naturally evolved into that kind of person.
Yeah.
So I wonder how, how many years at Red Bull? 10?
It was 10 years as a mechanic.
So 10 years at Red Bull. How was 10 years in that environment sort of shifted you as a character, do you think? Are you a different person today than the one that went into Red Bull 10 years before?
Like, entirely.
Yeah.
Like I tell you, actually, you said about having a bit of that sort of detail-oriented sort of personality anyway. I probably had loads of that, right? Yeah. Especially when I started at Red Bull, I was really focused and really driven and paid attention to detail in everything I was doing. But what I learned at Red Bull that I probably might not have learned anywhere else is what it really means to sort of be a teammate. So, I talk about it briefly. In the 10 years I spent at Red Bull, my only ever bad performance review, and I say bad, it wasn't horrific, but it wasn't a glowing performance review, which was my first year there. Yeah. And the reason for that being was that I went into the team so nervous and so sort of, right, I need to just focus on the work, do the work well, don't mess this up. These guys are world champions. I'd come from Marussia, who, it was a brilliant place to work, but, we hadn't achieved all this greatness that Red Bull had. So I came into it sort of a little bit like, right, I just need to keep my head down, focus on the work. And I got to the end of the year and I thought, yeah, I've done a brilliant job. All my work's been perfect. There's been no issues. And my chief mechanic turned around and said, Cal, look, you're doing all the work, mate, but this is Red Bull and we need you to get on with your colleagues. We need you to be close to them, like that's how it is here. Everybody knows about each other's lives. We're an incredibly close-knit team. Yeah. And that's how the team changed me. That was something that I learned in that first year. Yeah. And from then on, it sort of just grew and grew. And, as a member of the race team, and as you'll say with your own colleagues inside the team, you become incredibly close.
Yeah.
You spend that much time with people, last year, probably more than my own family, more than my child and my partner. So it's one of those things that I definitely learned in the job, was how to really engage with people and be close and make it personal. Yeah. I feel like the success in Formula One, a lot of it comes from it being personal, and it matters so much more when you appreciate the grind that everybody is putting in to achieve these goals. It's not just something that we're trying to do and it's a corporate thing. We might make it, we might not. It is personal.
Yeah, it matters to you, and it has to matter, because otherwise you probably wouldn't do it, and you certainly wouldn't do it to the level that we're all expected and required to do it too. How do you think that translates once you leave the sort of the everyday environment of being on the road with these people who do become like your family? As you said, you spend more time often than with your actual family. So one of the memories I've got of leaving that travelling circus is that, oh my goodness, am I going to lose touch with these people? Or are these relationships going to start to fade away? My own personal experience is that obviously there's a natural fading a little bit because you're not spending all that time, but those bonds will remain, I know, forever. In my case, I'm sure it'll be the same for you. But that importance of having a good team of people around you, I now take into my businesses, but also my friend groups, my social circles. Understanding how important the people around you are has something that really has left a massive impact on me from being within a Formula One team. Is it the same for you?
Absolutely. And do you know what? Something that I always stress to people when I'm talking about careers in F1 is I talk about the soft skills.
Yeah.
Like everyone in that garage, what they contribute to the environment. It's not necessarily just how good a mechanic they are or how well they know their bit of the car. The personalities of the contribution, and that's sort of something that I take with me into any project that I sort of take on now, is that the people I'm working with are going to determine the success. And it's not just about their skills, it's about the way that they do these things. Yeah.
Well, and also now, I guess when you turned up at Red Bull, you had very little control over who your teammates were. They were naturally selected by the team, selected to a very high level. So you ended up with elite level people around you generally. When you leave that environment and you're now out sort of almost on your own to a large extent, one of the struggles I found was operating in inverted commas, the real world. I mean, I've never found a builder that I'm happy with. I've never found any tradespeople. I struggle even working with organisations because maybe my tolerance is at a level where for most people it isn't. Have you found that, and have you found any solutions to come to terms with that? Because actually, even in your social circles, right, you've now got an opportunity to rebuild social circles that you've been out of for some time. Will you do that differently as a result of your experience at Red Bull?
I mean, do you know what? One of the things that, and I tell you what, it's one of the things I will always have, but I think I had it before F1, is I've got this thing about like lateness.
Yeah, me too.
Right? Like that's probably my biggest gripe. Like if I'm even 5 minutes late to something, I'm devastated. Yeah. Right? I'm devastated because it's really not me. But, it's like you said, you end up holding everybody else to this same, and sometimes I accept it's a bit of a ridiculous standard, but if we're meeting at this time, I'm there 15 minutes before. That's how I roll. So when you're at the circuit, there isn't, qualifying starts at this time. It has to be ready,
It's ingrained into you, isn't it?
Yeah, it just becomes very much a part of you. In terms of sort of like with my friends, I mean, it'd be impossible to hold my current crop of friends to these standards. And I'd probably just end up with no friends.
But I think more so that you're about to embark in a world where you're going to reach out and you're going to build what effectively will become your own business.
Yes.
And as you build any business, or as you build a network, whether it's professional or social, when you're building it from scratch, you get at least some control over who's in it.
Yeah.
And I think, I've certainly found, mostly through making mistakes, that you don't want everyone in it. You want certain people that are going to lift you up.
Absolutely.
That's what Formula One teams do very well.
Yeah, this is it. And, I remember, actually, I always think about interviewing with Dave Boys when I first started at Red Bull, and they ask you that, that typical question of, where do you want to be in 5 years? The every interview question ever.
What did you say?
And I said to Dave, I said, look, mate, if I look in 5 years' time, my job title isn't going to matter that much to me. My salary isn't going to matter that much to me, other than needing to put food on the table. I think one of the things that I've always aimed for is to be able to say that I'm an asset to anyone I'm working with.
Yep.
And that's very much the same. Like when I look now at the things that I'm doing and the people that I want to work with, it is purely about that. It's, I'm here and I can tell you what I can offer you. I want to know, how can you be an asset to what I'm doing? And like you said, it takes a lot of different people, a lot of different personalities, and those roles are all very different. But ultimately, you can find somebody who is an asset, and not somebody that's essentially a bit of a burden, And that's how it is in F1. I think more and more so, especially with the cost cap now. Obviously, even when you were in the paddock, we still had the operational personnel limit.
Yeah.
So those 60 jobs that you're allowed to have running the car, every one of them matters. There isn't really room for somebody to not be an asset in their role. Now, so with the cap, that applies across the whole business. Everybody their contribution has to matter.
Yeah, so true. let's talk about the differences between teams then, and because you just touched on something there that Red Bull gave you the sort of freedom or the opportunity to be yourself, which was a really important factor. If we think about some of the inspirational people you've worked with, drivers, but not just drivers, Formula One's full of, I've found, inspirational people. Was Red Bull, it seems like Red Bull was an organisation, attracted a lot of those people because of exactly that, because of giving them freedom and scope to be who they want to be. And the obvious example I'm thinking of, Adrian Newey left us at McLaren to join you guys at Red Bull because of exactly that. He felt restricted at McLaren. He was given the freedoms at Red Bull to go and design boats or whatever. Yeah. And maybe he's now had a similar thing at Aston Martin, which is why he's jumped again. But how important was that element of sort of tailoring what you offer your staff and personnel to suit their individual needs?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, over the years, it's quite clear that Red Bull have been very good at that. Because, I mean, as you know, they've never been the highest payers in the pit lane. I think McLaren always had that crown of being the best paying team. I think what Red Bull have always been really good at is, like offering people that sort of freedom, but also nurturing talent. I think of our now factory-based chief mechanic, Phil Turner, who, started as an apprentice when it was Jaguar.
I worked with Phil before Jaguar when he was in F3 years ago.
This is it, and there's a lot of people that have been there for a long time. The front-end mechanic on Max's car, Shaki, he's ticked over 300 races there, and I think it says a lot, when there's, for years and years, there have been better pay offers and things like that out there, but people... And the cost caps change that a little bit, but people as a whole, they stay, and I think it's partly that freedom and that willingness to sort of adapt and change to make it work for those people. But also it's about nurturing that talent and sort of seeing that whilst it's nice to have a procedure for everything and this and that and the other, actually you get the best out of people by letting them be autonomous and letting them get on with it.
So true, and I always think about this when. I often equate Formula One drivers to children, and there are so many similarities there. But, I've got 4 kids, right? I know you've got one, you've got a young daughter. But all of my 4 kids are completely different people. They all need very different things to be able to thrive. Some of them have excelled in the school system. Others just don't work with it. It doesn't work for them, So they all need to be treated differently to be able to thrive and ultimately succeed. I feel like Formula One drivers are the same. If we talk about the drivers or some of the drivers you worked with, and obviously this is particularly notable given the struggles of Red Bull's second seat. Yeah. Right. So we know how good Max is as a driver. So there's an obvious challenge with anyone who goes up against him because you're up against one of the best of a generation. But how much of it is tailoring what's required from that second driver, but also what the team can offer that second driver to enable them to thrive?
Yeah, I think environment is everything, I think, for drivers. And I think the prime example of that is probably Daniel Ricciardo. You look at Daniel when he was with the team and it was an environment that worked for him so well, we got on so well. It was very much one of those relationships where you could see that the environment was helping Daniel get the best out of himself. And obviously for him, that changed drastically when he decided to leave. So it's one of those things. And look, I don't envy any of the young drivers that have to go up against Max. But at the same time, I feel like, they've all got this far to F1 and we'll always try and be us and try and help it work and help it fit. But yeah, it's really difficult, like you said, you've got that guy in the other seat and the environment's really important for you. And we will always try and tailor that environment to make it work. But there's so many things.
What do you feel like the biggest hurdle, if you like, is Max? Not in any negative way, but in terms of just the talent you're facing, or do you feel like because Red Bull's quite a specific environment, maybe it's super free, super relaxed in many ways? Like you say, it worked for Daniel. Is it that some of these drivers haven't fitted into that as well, or is it all about who they're up against in the other car?
No, I think it's more than just about who they're up against. Look, I think for starters, the landscape of media in the sport and the nature of media in the sport, that's a huge part of it. Yeah. And that's changed drastically over even the last 5 years. The way that we report news and the way that sort of drivers and team personnel in general are sort of faced by the media now. I think that's a big part of it. I don't think it's necessarily all about who you're up against. like I said, these drivers have had competition all the way through their careers, and okay, fine, you haven't come up against Max Verstappen's every step of the way, but they've all had seasons where they've been up against someone that was really testing them, and they've all been through that. And it's one of those things. I think the climate when you get to the top, I can't imagine how overwhelming it must all become. And look, Red Bull as a team, it's a throw you in the deep end kind of place. Like even for me, like I remember when I first took on that sort of race team role, doing engines, I'd never done it. Right? I'd never done engine kitting in any shape or form. I'd always been a rear end mechanic or number 2 mechanic doing bits of the car. I'd never ever had to deal with engines, deal with suppliers, deal with shipping parts back and forth to the factory. I'd never had to do it. And it was like, right, look, this guy's unable to do this job anymore. He doesn't want to do it anymore. So we've got 3 races. You've got 3 races to shadow someone. And then my first race was Monaco, like on my own. So it's always been one of those, and it is, to an extent, that's life, isn't it? It's sink or swim.
Yeah, I know in the book you always say the answer is always to say yes to every opportunity, then figure it out afterwards. Right? So that was an example of that.
I like being thrown in the deep end anyway. I feel like it gets the best out of me. If you give me comfort, I'll enjoy that comfort. If you say to me, well, things ain't going to be comfortable, it's up to you to make it work, I'm fine, let's go.
I mean, do you see it, with the likes of Liam, but also others that have come through and ultimately not necessarily been successful in that car? Do you see it as... Can you equate it to, say, in your role, your position, someone giving you a different set of tools, a right-handed, you're left-handed, aren't you?
I am.
A right-handed set of tools that, you're left-handed, for example, and then you having to figure that out. Is it as sort of simplistic as that, as they're struggling to get around the technology or to get used to the characteristics of that car because it's so different to what they've been used to?
Yeah, I think ultimately it is, and like, Liam said himself, really, it's all about time.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, in the sport, time isn't something that you've always got, and he acknowledged that. So it's difficult because again, you're thrown into an environment where you have to adapt quickly.
Yeah.
And I think it's way more extreme than just having a set of tools that's slightly different. You're talking about hundreds of tools in that car that are all slightly different. And as well as new people, new engineers, new performance engineers. It's a lot to do at once.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess if you think about the Liam situation, it's not all bad because, he's still in Formula One and he's still got an amazing opportunity. Lots of people who don't succeed in their job in sometimes pretty brutal timelines are literally cast aside. He's been still kept in the family and he's still on the grid.
And look, I only had limited interaction with Liam, like from tests, but I can tell you from the conversations I've had with him, I'm not worried about him at all.
Yeah.
I think he's going to go back. I think he's going to get straight back to it. He's going to focus and look, I think also, like you said, Liam's not the only one that struggled to drive that second car. You look at Alex Albon, Pierre Gasly, but nobody looks at those 2 drivers now and thinks, oh yeah, but they struggled that 1 year in the Red Bull. We've forgotten about it. We've seen their performances for what they are, and I think Liam will be in exactly the same position.
Yeah, so true. Yeah. Let's talk about some of the inspirational characters that have left a mark on you through your journey, both drivers, but also anyone else that you've worked with. My memory is always that living every day inside an elite level Formula One team, you are surrounded by sort of excellence everywhere. And I remember people like Ron Dennis, for me, was an amazingly inspirational character. Adrian Newey, who you've obviously had the pleasure of working with as well. But are there people, names particularly, that have stood out for you, and what have they left with you?
Yeah, I mean, no, I spoke about a couple of the people already. When I talk about Phil Turner, just sort of when I sort of first learned about Phil's journey through the team and him.
So he was the chief mechanic at Red Bull for a long time.
He was the chief mechanic trackside when I first started. He's now in a factory-based role, so looking at the next year's car and how we can do stuff. But when I sort of found out Phil's journey and how he'd started as an apprentice, it's massively inspiring. And on top of that, I was really lucky early in my career to have people like Paul Bellringer around me who had sort of done it all. And, Paul spent loads of his time at BAR Honda as test team when, there was no restriction on testing and it was brutal. So, having people like Paul obviously understood hard graft. You've come from that world, you come from that world, you understand that. So it was nice to have those kind of inspiring people around me. I think one of the other ones, and I think there'd be plenty that struggle to give him his credit for it, is Jonathan Wheatley. I talk about Jonathan in my book, and one of the things that I say was from day one of meeting Jonathan and getting that job on the race team, it became apparent that this was probably the most competitive person I've ever met. Like And I know this as well, not just from my time with Jonathan, but whenever you speak to him about his past, like, I mean, you know, Jonathan had been racing in that paddock for like 30 years.
Yeah.
So obviously he had a lot of history up and down the paddock. I know some of it was with some old colleagues of yours. Yeah. And I remember talking to him about stuff like that. And he's like, no, I don't like that person. And these were feuds from like 20 years ago that Jonathan had been unable to forget. But, you know, seeing that sort of competitive nature from somebody that was essentially could have seen himself as above it all. You know, you sit on the pit wall, you're not in the trenches anymore.
Yeah.
He probably could have wound back on that, but he couldn't. It's in his nature to just be that competitive all the time. And Jonathan used to give us these little talks after qualifying that most of the garage used to find absolutely hilarious. But actually, when you looked at it and what he was saying, it sort of just goes, it sort of went to speak to just how important it all was for him. And I found it quite inspiring. You know, Jonathan for me was one of those people that he understood people very well. And I say this in that sometimes that could be very annoying, and he could get on my nerves, but it was because he knew exactly how to push my buttons, and he would do it to get the best out of me.
Yeah, and often that is the case, isn't it? The people that do push your buttons are often the ones that get the best out of you.
Yeah,
you know,
this is it.
It's so true, because they push you into areas that are often uncomfortable, but force you then to either learn a bit more about yourself or about the subject, and as a result you become better, right?
Yeah, for sure, absolutely.
I think Formula One's as an industry is really quite good at that, at pushing people into places that initially are uncomfortable, and it becomes a sort of norm, whereas for a lot of people outside that's an extreme type scenario, whereas actually almost every day you're being pushed in Formula One to some sort of uncomfortable place, because whether it's the amount of hours you've got to do, the time pressure you're under, the millions of people watching, or whatever it is, you're often being pushed to do something that, in the most part, is unusual. And therefore, because that becomes a normal situation, I've found that now, once I've left the sport and you're in this sort of outside world, if you like, you find that you're slightly unusual to other people because those things are not daunting for you.
No, for sure. Like, I think something that I've sort of learned a lot, it's just, you know, doing bits of media and this and that, and people say, "Oh, are you okay with this? Have you done it before?" And I'll be like, "Yeah, I'll be fine."
Yeah.
And they find it a bit weird, like, "Okay, fine," you know. I'm like with my manager and stuff, just doing bits and bobs, and they're always like, "Oh, that was quick," and I'm like, "Well, yeah, we're here to do something. Let's crack on, get it done."
Well, you're under a spotlight all the time, whether you're facing a camera, you know, as in doing something to a camera, or whether you're just working in a garage. You know, there's 2 or 3 cameras pointed at you at all times, and so I think in the beginning, and particularly now with Netflix, you know, holding a boom mic above your head at any given opportunity, there's an element partly that you may be a little bit cagey about, or at least aware of what you do and what you say, because you know it's being watched at all times. But secondly, it gives you a sort of comfortableness of having people watching, which I think is a sort of freeing thing. When you get out and you start doing stuff like this, it comes much more naturally, even though you may never have done it before.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I always noticed it in was pit stops.
Yeah.
Like, I always used to think to myself, like, early on, especially when Netflix first started, there would just be this awareness that if you screw this up, it's
gonna make the title sequence.
Do you know what I mean? It's gonna be the title sequence, or, you know, even with social media, there was always for a long time there was this thing in my mind that, you know, this is gonna be all over social media if I balls this up.
Yeah. See, I didn't really have that, of course.
Yeah, and you know, it took a really long time and a sort of acceptance that, you know what, some of these are gonna go wrong.
Yeah.
You know, to sort of get past it.
Let me give you the flip side to that, right? Because when I first started, and for the first few years of my time in the sport, there was no such thing as social media. There weren't even camera phones. This is how old I am. There weren't even camera phones for the beginning part of that. But the difference that made was that it gave you almost, and this was dangerous at times, complete freedom to kind of do and get away with anything, because you knew that it wasn't being captured.
Yeah.
Now the world, just the world in general, but specifically the world of a high-profile sport like Formula One, is completely different. And you have to be hyper-aware at all times that you've got to behave in the right way, because it's going to be seen, it's going to be shared, but also that you're representing brands and big companies. It's a totally different game, isn't it, in that regard?
No, I mean, that's obviously for me, it was quite a personal thing that once I started to grow this profile was, you know, reminded obviously of my responsibility, not only to the team, but like you say, to all the team's partners and things like that. It's inescapable now. You know, you have to be aware that that's going on. And
the people that you're going to now inevitably be an inspiration to.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I mean, let's talk about that, because that's, the next stage of your life, I know, is largely centered around exactly that. It's inspiring others, it's educating others, it's trying to change the sport for the better.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to sort of get into this idea of the legacy that you leave behind. I've heard you talk about how important the legacy that Lewis Hamilton will leave behind, way above and beyond what he does behind the steering wheel.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you're following, some sort of similar path? Do you feel a similar level of responsibility in what you do now?
I mean, on a much smaller scale, but yes, in terms of the responsibility, I think it's probably the same. I feel like a lot of time, especially in sports, we talk about people in sports and people in the public eye being role models and things like that. And I've always said that, none of those people have a responsibility to do that.
Yeah.
Until you choose, of course, to put yourself in that position. And it's very much something that I enjoy. So I've put myself in that position. And then, yes, once you do that, it's a responsibility. I can't be out here trying to promote some of the amazing careers in the sport, but at the same time, behaving like an arse and doing this and the other. It does become a responsibility, and you do have to think about it sort of all the time. But, like I said, it's not a burden.
No.
I don't think of it like a burden. I think of it like, actually, this is something that's way more fulfilling than going out and earning a salary doing other stuff. So I enjoy it. It's something that I sought out for myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's been a pathway to get here, but yeah, I think it's great.
I always look at it like, I come from a different perspective of you, in that there's a lot of privileges that I enjoyed that you certainly didn't, and your journey through Formula One must have looked completely different, not having the representation ahead of you that I clearly had. But I always look at that path that we've both followed, having operated at such a high level in such an amazing sport, and particularly at the top end of that, as a real privilege. I look back at every day, and I hopefully will never take it for granted. My mission today is to sort of pass on some of that privilege to others.
Yeah.
I mean, what would you say your mission is now for the next few years of your life?
Yeah, I think more than anything, I think the one thing that I wanted to, and it was certainly my primary goal for the book, was to just open eyes. Like I said, it took me way too long to discover motorsport. I've got plenty of gripes with the British education system when it comes to sort of engaging kids with STEM. So that's really sort of the mission that I've taken on, in terms of, if one thing that I can provide is awareness, then that's what I want to do, and it's not a hard task.
Yeah.
It's not like it's a really hard task to go and talk to people about Formula One and explain how they can progress, but it's something that you have to just go and do.
Yeah, exactly. And if you wind the clock back and think about if you'd had someone doing that for you back in the day, how much, whether it would have been easier, but certainly it would have opened the door earlier, like you say, and that's a key point. It's a little bit like getting the drivers to come through from underrepresented backgrounds, isn't it? You have to open the door much earlier in the system to get more females into karting, and to more minority groups into karting, because that's the catchment area that you're then going to eventually pluck the ones that get to the very top out of. Yeah. Opening the door earlier is surely the key to that. I
think opening the door earlier and keeping that door open, so like some of the various projects I sort of get to work with now with Red Bull, one of them is STEMX, where it's a curriculum for 9 to 14-year-olds. And then we have our own talent academy to take on apprentices when they're sort of leaving school. And then our graduate program, trying to entice people that have got these degrees and that have all the skills that we're looking for, and enticing them into our world. Yeah. So yes, about creating that pipeline, throughout your life, to sort of keep that door open and just keep you interested. Because as I said, for me, the biggest thing was just awareness and interest. Like I don't know how it was for you, but I think for me, living in London, in a built-up area, there's access is limited. Yeah. You don't get to see a lot of it. So unless you sort of have someone in your life that's already interested in the sport and will introduce you to it, you can go quite a while without sort of discovering it at all.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and even then, when you discover it, it feels like a sort of elitist. Yeah. You're like so far away from what your reality is. And I mean, I was lucky in that I happened to live near a racetrack near Brands Hatch, and way back in the day, Formula One used to come to town, used to be at Brands. So it descended onto my doorstep, and that's what gave me this little window to say, oh, what's this? I could hear it actually from miles away back in the day. But it gives you that opportunity to discover it and then explore it. And it took a long time for me to then start to appreciate that it could be an opportunity that I could get involved in. And I guess that's a part of what you're trying to do now, is to break down those barriers where, even though the pinnacle of motorsport is this amazing sort of high level operation, it's not out of reach for pretty much anybody if the doors are open enough.
Yeah.
Or at least if they feel like the doors are easy to push open.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that, and also that the skill set required is way bigger.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, the skill set required in modern Formula One and the things that teams are looking for and the different roles is grown so much that there's, you know, in some ways there's more opportunity than ever.
Yeah.
Admittedly, in some ways it's a more competitive job market than ever. But like you said, you know, sparking that interest is that opportunity.
Yeah.
You know, until you spark that interest, there is no opportunity. So yeah, that's been the goal for a little while now.
I mean, we just talked about inspirational characters. Lewis surely must be one of those for you. I know you had the opportunity to sit down with him a while ago, didn't you, to talk about some of this stuff?
Yeah, I talk about how it's sort of related to me personally. I always say that all of my dad's side of the family all live in like this 1 square mile in East London. They're all very, very connected to the Caribbean culture. Growing up in North London with my mum, I never felt as connected to my Caribbean culture as they did. And it was one of those things for me, like Lewis, when he started having these discussions and talking about diversity in the sport and things like that, it was inspirational for me, to somebody, you know, who Lewis put a lot on the line to do all of that. He faced plenty of criticism for talking about those issues. So it was one of those things for me. I'm like, you know, if Lewis can do all of this, then surely I can donate a little bit of my time to try and help the cause. I can be more myself. Like I said, you know, I'd wanted to grow my hair since I was a kid, and my mum and dad, they'd both quite sensibly taught me about all the implicit biases that can come with, you know, Caribbean hairstyles and things like that. And I just sort of got to a point where I was like, look, I'm in a comfortable position with my job, and my team know me and they know my skills. These shouldn't be issues for me anymore, so I'm going to go and do it. But, you know, like even things like that, you know, Lewis was an absolute inspiration to me, just in terms of, I think, his sort of bravery and willingness to sort of put his own reputation on the line and use his voice and his platform. And, you know, there will have been people that were really unhappy that he was doing all of these things. And he said, you know, screw you. I know what's right, and I know what needs to be done, and I'm going to go and do it. And yeah, for me, that was massively inspirational.
What was the conversation like when we literally sat around a table together discussing this?
Yeah, it was basically Lewis and his manager had approached Jonathan Wheatley, and they'd said, look, we'd love to grab a minute with Cal, if you don't mind, to come and talk about the Hamilton Commission. And Jonathan came and saw me straight away, and he was like, look, Cal, they've asked if you have a meeting after quali tonight or whatever, and I think you should do it. I think it's really important. And I was like, yeah, sweet. And we went and did it, and it was really nice. It was really nice, actually, more than anything, to, you know, we were in the midst of sort of a battle between us and Mercedes. And it was really nice that this was something that could be sort of non-partisan, something that we could all sit down, talk about openly. There was no team rivalry about it. This was completely separate to what was going on the sporting side.
Yeah.
And it was just quite humbling. You know, more than anything, the fact that Lewis thought that I could have an input that was valuable and that I could offer some insight into the things that he needed to know, was incredible for me.
And was there, it's an interesting point actually, because obviously, particularly around the Abu Dhabi 21, we won't get into all of that because I know you've done it millions of times, but the rivalry between Max and Lewis, obviously around that time, was at probably its peak. Yeah. Not necessarily because those two were in any sort of, there was no beef necessarily, more it's between the fans, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
So sitting down with Lewis when you're working directly with Max, that was a nice example of how Formula One behind the scenes often comes together to help each other for a bigger cause. Yeah. And we see it so much. I don't think it's covered enough or represented enough in the media side of what Formula One coverage is. Yeah. I mean, I think back to the Williams fire in Barcelona when everyone came to their rescue to sort of help them out, not just on the day, but afterwards, supplying equipment. McLaren had it recently with their motorhome having an incident. There's a huge camaraderie and a huge family feel behind the scenes in Formula One, aside from what happens on track, isn't there? And I think that's such a valuable part of what Formula One is.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's probably the the only bit where I feel like probably Drive to Survive has sort of failed to portray that to fans.
Well, it's not as interesting. It's not as box office.
I get it. It's not as box office, but like I've said before, there's a lot of love in the paddock and a lot of respect, and even things I think about in that 21 season, I was stood out the back of the garage and Lewis and Angela were there. And we were chatting, and he said to me, Cal, when are you going to come and work on my car? And I said to him, and we had a chat, and I said to him, look, Lewis, it'd be an honour to come and work on your car, but at the same time, loyalty is really important to me. When I needed a job, when Marussia folded and I was desperately trying to stay in the paddock, it was Red Bull that gave me that opportunity. And it takes a hell of a lot for me to sort of think, well, maybe it's time for me to go and do something else, when really that kind of loyalty doesn't come around that often.
And look, it's paying you back now.
No, exactly that. So, but yeah, there is a whole world that people don't get to see in Formula One. And it would be really nice, I think, if we could portray a little bit more about how close they are. Like even, Christian and Toto in the heat of that 2021 season, there's always been a lot of respect there. And it's one of those things we understand that it is all of our jobs to compete against one another, but that's one side of the pit lane.
Exactly. Right,
and then out here there is a world with people that live in it, and those people matter.
Yeah, that's so true. The thing that jumps out for me in that regard is that back in sort of 2005 and 6, we at McLaren were in a real fight with Renault. So Fernando Alonso versus Kimi were the two drivers in the fight there, and it went all the way to the wire kind of, and it was brutal on track. It was really brutal between the teams. The political games were brutal as they were back then, but the moment it was all over, I remember Ron Dennis saying to us when they'd won the championship that year, it was right, go and get all of the champagne we have, get yourself down to their garage and just unload it in their garage, celebrate with them. And it was an amazing moment that both teams suddenly dropped their guard, came together, had massive respect and appreciation for what the other team had managed to achieve. And there was nothing underhand about what they'd won. It was just that they did a better job at the time. And
it's exactly the same now, like even some of the years where we've had, like close battles with Mercedes in 2021, among those working, like we said earlier, you're all in the trenches.
Yeah.
There has to be that sort of mutual respect at least for the work that we're all doing. And that's always been there. Perhaps we could do a bit of a better job of sort of portraying that to the public.
Well, yeah, as I say, it's probably not as box office as some of the dramas that we do see. But just taking some of those learnings, and perhaps let's bring this to a close by thinking about the bigger picture of, if you look back at your 10 years at Red Bull, but 13 years in Formula One?
Yep.
So that's a fair amount of time. I mean, I did 10 years and I know it's impacted my life forever. So what are the biggest takeaways that you take from that time that you think will now benefit you in whatever's to come next?
I mean, one of the biggest things that I've learned is that ultimately, there's winning and there's not winning. That's probably the first thing.
Yeah.
You can do things in a multitude of different ways. There's never one pathway to your goal. That's definitely something I've learned in my time. But ultimately, there's a path that will take you to where you want to be, and then there's the other paths. But I think that more than anything, I'll take away with me is that ultimately, like we said at the beginning, you can do everything right, and it can not go your way.
Yeah.
Ultimately, you can do most things right, and that little bit of luck will push you over the edge. But the only way there really is to success is by putting the work in.
And it's enjoying having the process be the thing that you're proud of, isn't it? Because the end result, as you say, is often beyond your control. You can have you can execute the best race weekend ever, but someone tags you at the start and you're in the wall before you know it. It doesn't take anything away from all that excellent work you did. No. And this is a message that I'm always trying to push onto my children. And there's a lot that I've taken from operating at this level. And that's one of those big things, is that you need to be proud of the way you get up every day and show up and the habits and the sort of patterns you form, because those are the things that you do have control of. The end result is often beyond your control. So if you pin everything on that, there's a high chance you're going to be disappointed. Yeah. And we've all been there.
Yeah, for sure. The losses are as important as the wins as well. And it's one of the things that I say to people who are looking to embark on careers in racing is I say, look, the first thing you should know is that there is no shortcut to long-term success.
Yeah.
And secondly, that ultimately the journey to your goal is what is going to give you the skills to thrive if you reach it.
Yeah.
You know, like I think of my journey to Red Bull Racing and all the things that I did to get to Formula One. All the things that I learned on that journey was what gave me the skills to thrive once I got there.
Yeah.
So there really is no shortcut to it. You know, you can find success quite quickly, but the way you deal with it without those skills is going to be very different to what you can make of it with those skills.
Well, and also sustaining that success is a different ball game altogether, isn't it? And that's what comes from the sort of daily habits or the way you show up.
Absolutely.
Have you got any daily habits that have developed from your time in Formula One that maybe you didn't have before?
I think the biggest thing that I learned about myself, and it was probably more so with our like old curfew systems, is I discovered that I am a morning person.
Yeah.
And now it's something that I absolutely do. I get up in the morning, I do the school run, and I try and achieve all of my things for the day before like midday, because that's the best of me. So that's when I'm going to do it the best. So I try and get up in the morning, I try and get on with it, and then in the afternoon, as my afternoon rolls on, maybe I'm getting a bit old now, I like an afternoon nap with the cricket on the telly.
Well, that's something you couldn't have done at Red Bull.
No, for sure, but that's definitely one of the things that I've learned about myself, is that making the most of my mornings is the best way. And I used to do the same at the circuit. So like your busy days, your Wednesday, Thursday, I would get to the circuit and I would try and crack on immediately. And then hopefully post lunch we can just do a bit of pit stop practice, everything be nice, and get out of there before curfew.
Nice.
Not that ever works.
No, but that's good. It does. I think it teaches you a lot about yourself in the way that we talked about earlier, where it pushes you in so many regards. As one of the consequences of that is you find out an awful lot about yourself, about when you operate best, what chronotype you are, or what, you know, who pushes your buttons and why. It's all of that stuff, isn't it? You figure a lot out. I've come out of Formula One much more self-aware than when I went in, and that now helps me every single day.
I don't know why. I don't know why it is. I don't know if it's like, sometimes it can be, I know, you with your team, sometimes F1 it can be a bit lonely. You know, it can be a bit of a lonely world, you know, in a hotel room or on a flight or whatever.
Which feels like an odd thing to say for people at home, because you're with such a big team.
Yeah, I think sometimes it doesn't matter who you're with, you know, those situations where you are ridiculously tired, you know, you're stressed out, whatever, it can become quite a lonely place. And I've always been okay at sort of using that time to think to myself. Like one of the things that I do, my colleagues always used to spot me, was that I talk to myself. I talk to myself all the time. Right. And it was one of the ways that I probably dealt with that, you know, I learned to sort of hash out my thoughts and everything out loud in my own head.
Yeah. Well, I think the truth is everyone talks to themselves. Most people do it in their head. But, you know, it's fine. It's the most common conversation we have is with ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think getting comfortable to have that is a really important skill, because, you know, first of all, you've not always got someone to talk to, but also no one understands you like you do. No. So quite often figuring that stuff out internally is the very first step. What are the things you're going to miss most about being on the road? I mean, you tell me and then I'll tell you what I missed.
I mean, it's a difficult one. I mean, the obvious one for me is pit stops.
Yeah, same.
It was ultimately one of the main reasons I wanted to pursue Formula One. You know, I had that light bulb moment at the 2009 British Grand Prix, and I saw all of the teams doing pit stop practice, and it just became a very sort of fixed goal in my head to do it. And then once I got that experience and that adrenaline rush, it's a very hard thing to shake off. So that's probably the most obvious thing that I'm going to miss. I think the other thing is a lot of it, and it's hard at times because the travel can be really brutal. But it is going to be the lifestyle, you know. Like I was essentially, certainly before my daughter was born, so first part of my time in F1, I was a nomad, and I loved it. You know, I had very little roots anywhere, like, you know, no mortgage to worry about, you know, things like that. And it very much became sort of an ingrained part of me, is that I was in different places all the time. You'd never track me down. It was hard to get me on the phone. I quite liked it, you know. So that's something that I'm going to miss. But also, it's a lifestyle thing. I remember watching. Obviously, I was watching the first two races this year, and in Australia, I got up early and I watched quali. And then I thought to myself, now they'll all be going out to Stalactites to get a wicked kebab in Melbourne, and then they'll go up to the rooftop bar and they'll have a few drinks, and I'm going to miss that, you know. And it's been about weighing it up for me. Like, ultimately, I said to myself, really, you know, you've achieved all your goals in F1. You're only doing it now because you're being selfish and you like the lifestyle. So I'm definitely going to miss that.
Yeah. Have you been biffed out the WhatsApp group yet?
All of them, apart from like the personal ones, so all the work ones, obviously, 'cause, you know, like we used to have a WhatsApp group for car faults, so the team were never going to let me keep getting pictures of the car come through on my phone, so that's understandable. But there's a couple of like personal, like private, like team group, friend groups that I'm still in, so we still chat.
Yeah, good. Well, you know, my version of that is exactly the same. I mean, literally exactly the same. Pit stops were the thing that I still miss today.
Yeah.
All these years later, that adrenaline rush just can't be replaced with anything. It's just the most incredible thing. So I still miss that. And also this idea of being in a team and always having someone there to have your back. You know, now that responsibility falls to my wife or sort of some of my closest friends. But the team was always there because you spend so much time, not just working, but living around the world together. They really do become a family. And so inevitably, when you spend 200 days a year on the road, a lot of your problems are going to happen when you're out with those people, not with your family. So having that immediate support network around you is something that you have to I find you have to rebuild or you have to replace. And it comes naturally with your loved ones, but there's not as many of them and they're not always there, literally physically next to you, which they are in Formula One. So there's a huge comfort that comes with that. But I had the same obsession from being a young kid, obsessing about pit stops. You know, I was able to make that happen and become, you know, live that dream. And it really was a dream. And it's still the thing that pulls my heartstrings today, you know. Is there anything that you want to leave people with, as you know, that we haven't yet discussed in this conversation that you'd love to share with people, that perhaps whether it's on the next stage of your journey or something you've learned from the journey so far?
No, I mean, I think I really tried quite hard to get all of the things that were most important to me about the sport into the book. I think like you said at the beginning, the thing that sort of comes across the most is just about persistence. I think the other thing that I like to impart on people, particularly those who aspire to work in the sport or have an interest in working to the sport, is that I say to them that the pathways, they're not always clear, they're not always direct, but what you will find is that they are malleable. Yeah. You know, and that if you're willing to be as dedicated as you need to be, you can make a pathway work for you.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Well, I think, as you said, you know, even just your own experience at Red Bull versus mine at McLaren, who are both wildly successful in the sport, did it through completely different means, different paths to get there. It just shows you exactly that. There isn't just one route to success or to the top.
Yeah, for sure. And like, you know, I started, I was an engine technician just a year ago, you know, and ultimately I saw an opportunity to make a change for myself, and I was in the right place for that to be possible. But also, you know, I was the one that had to make it happen and do it and ultimately take that leap.
Yeah.
So yeah, sometimes the other thing is it's sometimes just about being a bit fearless and sort of saying, this could go wrong, but if I don't do it, I'm never going to know.
And that, I guess, feels like very much the Formula One philosophy, isn't it? If you don't give it a go, you're never going to find the opportunity or whether it's an advantage as a team. Formula One in itself is about breaking new ground, experimenting, trying new things to try and get ahead of your competition. You deserve a huge amount of respect for taking that leap, because I know from experience how hard it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a lot of people in this sport, in those garages up and down the pit lane, that have been there forever. And a lot of them complain, they moan, but they're still there. Yeah. And so to take the leap of faith, to go and experiment and try something new, is a brave move, but it's also a really bold one. And I know that one that has a vast amount of opportunities on the other side. I need to say thank you for writing the book.
Because I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
I read it, as I said, pretty much my entirety of my flight to Australia this year was spent reading it. And I couldn't put it down because it had so many similarities. There are not many people that have come through this sport and done what you and I have done.
No, I mean, when I first thought about this project, and I thought to myself, I only know one other person that's done that.
Well, yeah, and it's effectively like the next generation of my book. And my book, by the way, was a generation or two after a guy called Steve Matchett. Yes. I don't know if you've read his book.
I haven't. I've got it on my shelf. It's on the list.
So many years ago, when I was just a kid, he'd written a book, and he was probably the first, I think. He was a mechanic at Benetton, for those who want to go and check it out. And I actually messaged him. I spoke to him, found his email address and tracked him down. And he gave me a little bit of advice and encouraged me to go and do my own. And that's what really sparked the idea for me. So to see you carrying this sort of tradition on, if you like, but also it's an important part, because these books in a world of social media that's so fast paced, unchecked,
Yeah.
there's a lot of misinformation on social media. I think books are one of the last places that we can really trust information.
Yeah.
They take a huge amount of time and energy to write, so total respect for doing that. I'm into writing my second one now, and I'm being reminded of how hard it is. But your journey's an important one. It will inspire a huge number of people. It's been fascinating for me to see the similarities and the differences of our two worlds, but a few years apart. And for other people, as you just touched on earlier on, this is going to be one of the things, as Steve Matchett's book was for me, that makes it a real proposition for people, that makes it something that's attainable, whereas before it might seem like something you just see on television when you flick the TV on Sunday afternoon. And for that reason alone, it's important. You are being the representation that you never had. So,
thank you so much. That's really kind.
Thank you on behalf of everyone who hasn't yet read it, because you will thank me. Go and get the book. I'll put the link in the description, plus a link to Calum's socials. But look, huge thank you for coming down today and sharing the conversation.
An absolute pleasure, and thank you for being my inspiration.
Well, that's very kind. But no, thank you, mate. I'm excited for you, because I know what the future what's there for you, which it's not always obvious to see when you're buried inside a Formula One team. So
no, for sure.
It's exciting times ahead.
Thank you, mate.
Cheers, mate. Well, that was a fascinating conversation, on a personal level for me especially, but I hope you enjoyed it too. There are so many little nuggets in there that we can all learn from and benefit from. If you want to know more, go and follow Calum. He's at F1Mech on Instagram, and definitely go and find his book. I'll put a link in the description. You can help this channel and this podcast by engaging in whatever way you can. Like, follow, subscribe, leave us a comment. It all makes a huge difference. And until we meet again next time, don't forget this. Do the right things, do the things right.